So good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank both Berthold Schöner and Ellie Byrne and the staff who helped put this visit together. It's been really a pleasure to be back in Manchester. This is pretty much a work in progress, sort of drawing on bits and pieces of things. So it's an invitation in that sense also to think along with the line of argument that I'm undertaking over here. So I want to think aloud about the conditions of state formation in and from which the intertwining of the categories race, religion, militarization, and by extension war was historically produced. So I have a series of slides they don't all look like this, happily. Partly to keep you awake in the late afternoon as I drone on, but also as a way of supplementing what I have to say. So race emerges as an explicit mode of estranging production of what Fanon in various places called dehumanization, and indeed by extension might have called deracialization in the initial actual use of the term racialization. Wasn't really used before Fanon and used differently as dehumanization than it has tended to be used more contemporarily. So it emerges as this mode of estranging production in the mid-15th century at the very moment of delineating a European we. I mean, this is now well known in papal letters and so on in the 1450s. Of European self-formation and its constitutive outsiders, not just the Jews and the Muslims of conversion and expulsion, but blacks too. And so just a symbol of dehumanization. And then the sense of the expulsion of Jews, the expulsion of Moors, who are also in part seen as black, of being of African origin. You think of a century later, or a century and a half later, of Shakespeare's Othello and The Merchant of Venice, sort of the way in which these categories come into the imaginary of the European self-identification. Two significant considerations to note in this historical emergence. First, race is, of necessity, is noted from the outset of its formulation and social fashioning with religious resonance. Jews, Muslims, black and Indian heathens, as Europe's outside, as I said. And as race, in its morphing and consenting significance, is adopted increasingly as a central technology of modern state constitution and reason, even you might say in denial, it both displaces and assumes some of the resonances of the theological and the religious it is taken to displace. So I'm going to list what I take to be some of those religious resonances that race, both as it's displacing, takes them up in its self-expression, so to speak, even somewhat implicitly and silently. So the narrative of origins, the passion and force of kinship commitment, the naturalizing of the artifice of socially produced and fashioned identifications, the imagining of mass community out of social anonymity, indeed, the projection of generalized characterization across the artifice of population from a narrow base of immediately familial or communal experience. The insistence on destiny, the remainders of an hierarchical flock pastoral in racially shaped conceptions of population governance, as Leroy Medavoy has forcefully argued in a quite marvelous piece about the relation between race and religion about a year ago in Social Text. And later, as race becomes the object of critical account rather than taken up as primarily productive of sociality, the dismissal as socially antique, a holdover from the pre-modern, the slippage into social regression. I mean, both religion and race sort of have had throughout modernity, throughout secularization, you might say, that kind of resonance. Race, in short, is the secularization of the religious, and I mean that quite straightforwardly. Abstractly assuming and pulling more or less silently into its own terms of articulation the technologies and expressions of its productive socialities. Second, and consequently, it is not just that in modern state formation, race has been a key causal consideration in war making. That much is obvious, you could say. It is also the case that race has been born, fashioned, and reproduced in war making. So Foucault makes a point in Inverting Clausewitz that politics is war by other means rather than the reverse, right? I mean, he's inverting Clausewitz here. So politics is war by other means. So the modern technologies of governing through and by race, you could say, are war by other means. Literally the raison d'etat, and you could say raison d'etre, of the modern state. I've long puzzled over Foucault's notion of the sense of race war in society must be defended. I mean, he can't mean this literally, right? Because it makes no historical sense if you trace the history of race formation. And so I just want to suggest, somewhat in passing, that what he has to mean is that the struggles, the fights, the wars, the battles that take place, what he characterizes as prior to the 19th century, which is the moment of racism in his formulation, I think somewhat wrongly, fashions the model around which these kinds of class struggles are taking shape, right? So what he means by race war is the model it provides for thinking about the kinds of class struggles that have taken place throughout the emergence of the modern. Pretty much mirroring the logics racial conflicts come to assume in this period. So the social dynamics and logics of the former conceptually map onto those of the latter. Here war is not reducible merely to the firing of guns and cannon. The transformational grammar of race, historically articulated as kinship, lineage, type, species, subspecies, more or less in that order, is worked out over time as expressions and determinants of these social struggles, which in a broader, more abstract sense could be characterized as class struggles. Now, a claim to sovereignty entails establishing the grounds of state legitimacy by tracing it to its form of origination. You can think here of the central role of social contract theory in setting the terms of modern political theory. This tracing to origins devolves more and more into abstraction as traces of actual state formation, iteration, even transformation, its subjections, dominations, exclusions, violence, in short, its force, disrupt the drive to legitimation, ultimately pressing at its limits, throwing it into crisis. This recourse to origins as the grounds of state standing and its legitimation is of necessity theological, as Schmidt early in the 20th century noted. What are the technologies, you might say, here of force precisely? The modes of domination and subjection, exclusions and instrumentalities of control and subject making that make up the state, that enable it to function. This line of analysis, you could say, offers up a very different critical genealogy, both of state formation and of political theory of the modern state, than a concern with the founding justificatory grounds of state formation that you found in contract theory from Hobbes onwards, right? Which is much more abstract in its formulation. So the modern state's dance with death, accordingly, is no error, not an accident, not simply the externality of collateral damage, a marginal condition, however rationalized. It is part of its defining constitution, you might say its very nature. Allowance, in Foucault's terms letting live, and erasure, making die, become in the reversals of the contemporary that of enforcement, making live, and abandonment, letting die. Is it the case that perpetual war, not the Enlightenment's perpetual peace, now marks the very being of modern statehood, I mean contemporarily, right? Exhausted as much of the world's population may be by this. The sovereign state's, you might say, abiding condition. I mean, even as much of the population is exhausted by it, what of late has been characterized as the 1% is either untouched by this condition or profit-making off of it, as profit-making has long been made off war-making. But war here must be taken not only in its very narrow sense of a time-bound battle, but as characterizations of every battle or violent confrontation, every struggle, ultimately to the death, both literal and metaphorical, of people, of the social conditions to which the state is opposed or unqualifiedly committed, of every antagonism, rivalry, confrontation, and struggle between individuals, groups, classes, races, as Foucault puts it. You could say is anything but modest in this formulation, but maybe in his formulation generally. Race in the scheme of things become a, if not the principal modality of explicit state delimitation of the subhuman or substandard human, the inferiorized, the deviant, the degenerate, the immature from which you could say, society, as Foucault himself puts it, must be defended. It is in defense against the barbarians at the gate and the barbarians within, both now. From the inferior to the immature, the deviant to the criminal, the abnormal to the unbelonging, the ungrateful critic as much as the unwanted immigrant, the corrupt and the cancerous, that the military and the police are institutionalized as the first and last lines of defense. The former against the socially threatening from without, the latter from those within, that is, military without, police within, although the functions of those two, in a sense, bleed into each other. Against all those, call them the sub-races, from which the society must purge and purify itself. So you get this, sorry, I'm running ahead of myself. I mean, the sense in which gaming sort of draws on sub-racial formulations and categorizations which now fuel the kind of cultural imaginary of, not just kids, but adults as well in very prominent ways today, right? And this drawing, if you think of 19th century representations, these are taken up in order to think about game design for contemporary gaming, right? So there's a way in which these things get recycled. Modern Europe was conceived, as I've argued elsewhere, through a series of excisions, together with global territorial extensions. All this is well known. Each slid together mature religious and incipient racial conception. Inquisitions, legal and policy debates, as well as empire building, tied intra-European conditions and concerns to global contests. The skirmishes, battles, wars that inevitably flared in and from the European imperial project pretty much from the outset were racially driven and rationalized. It's not that religious considerations were not involved in colonial conflicts, of course, namely the mission and rationalization that Christians should bring unbelievers to proper religious realization. But unlike medieval crusades, such conflicts were for the most part not only and often not foremostly prompted by religious concern. So let's say in short that colonial conflicts were primarily racial rather than, even if shored up by, religious affairs. Colonial conflicts were about establishing control of populations and territory over whom Europeans took themselves to have a right, God-given to be sure, to preside. Race was taken principally and literally as the elsewhere, the rough-hewn outside, the non-belonging, to be cast out when they attempt to overstay their welcome. I'm thinking here there's a book about to be published by Sari Makdisi, the really quite wonderful scholar of both 18th, 19th century Romanticism in Britain, the Romantic scholars, but maybe better known to an audience like this for his work on Palestine. He's Palestinian Lebanese himself by background, teaches at UCLA. And he's just written a book which will be out from the University of Chicago Press soon, in which he's literally speaking about the Orientalizing in the late 18th and early 19th century, using the very terms of Orientalization of the English working class. So the very notion of Arabization is used at the time explicitly in those terms, right? To externalize the working class of the British, right? It's a very, very compelling, interesting textual argument, drawing on Romantic writers in compelling ways. Could I get some water? I'm sorry to be abrupt like this. It would be wonderful. Thank you. By contrast, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, intra-European wars as the designation so often indicated, were religious in concern, so in contrast to what I've characterized as the racial. Following somebody like Medavoy arguing that these wars helped to shift the very significance of the religious in Europe from the medieval to the modern, from Christendom to Christianity, I mean the very terms that get used by he and William Cavanaugh, from a hierarchical structure of ordering beliefs and behaviors to a personal creed of individual conviction, more or less independent of state imposition. Thanks so much, Eddie. So it's not only with the increasing ubiquity of racial definition, characterization, and rationalization from the mid-18th century onwards, reflected not least in racially inscribed rankings of national character, I think here of Rousseau, Hume, Kant, etc., that intra-European wars start to take on and be driven by racial expression. Racially indexed warring in Europe thickens in the 19th century as institutional religious determination recedes, or better yet becomes less a function of state that religion becomes less a function of state insistence and more an individualizing pursuit. Institutionally ordered, to be sure, but expression of a personal commitment socially pressured and produced at basis nonetheless. 20th century Euro-driven wars in the end are more likely racially marked than religious. Even the anti-Muslim fervor at the close of the last and opening of this century has what I want to insist, has a civilizational more than a traditionally or reductively religious thrust to it. So it's not about not straightforwardly about the content of religious belief, right? About doctrine. It's more about what it's taken to stand for, in a sense, culturally. In retrospect, the Haitian counter-revolutionary heavy-handedness of the French, the British connivance leading to the Chinese Opium Wars and the Anglo-Boer War at the beginning of the 20th century can be seen inter alia as rehearsals not only for how European powers would deal with their own working and immigrant classes, but also for the conduct of the First and Second World Wars. In all these instances, some in a way twisting Anne Stoller's kind of argument, right? In all these instances, religion had become a less principally determining force than a rationalizing fabrication intertwined with the more largely looming ethno-racial determination, consideration, and rationalization. Race inherits from the religious and updates, secularizes by naturalizing presumptions of purity and purification. Perpetual struggles to the point of wars are waged in the name of these purification and purging rituals. From national insistence to preserve purified traditions of one kind or another, sometimes explicitly racial, as in, you might say, France is a white European Christian nation that got resurrected by the Identity Soup campaign about 5 years ago. Either in that sense explicitly racial, or what I'm going to call racially religious, the genealogy of the Jewish state from Herzl on, right, in the mid-19th century, or religiously racial. So I'm turning these things around, not just in the sense of interpreting all aspects of the world through a racial prism, though that too, but also in the sense of religious prompt and legitimation of racist social formation, as you find, for example, in Calvinist Afrikaner apartheid, I mean, represented by this kind of construction, right? So I'm trying to look at the relation and contrast between what I'm characterizing as the racially religious and the religiously racial, right? And to think about what those distinctions might amount to. Perhaps the slippage between the religious and the racial, not merely their trade-offs, but their interdiction, is one compelling reason why, in the wake of the late modern, arguably neoliberal displacement of racial authority from the public to private spheres, about which I've written in The Thread of Race, its erasure as a driving formal state legal modality of governing, at least explicitly, that is race. We have witnessed a surprising easiness with which religious rearticulation, long thought and indeed characterized, if not wished away as medieval, has taken hold so assertively again of social expression and state practice, and why this has occurred exactly at the moment that formal, legal, bureaucratic, administrative racial expression has been under considerable pressure as an articulating principle of explicit state arrangement. So this, at least in the American context, but I think you could find parallels elsewhere. In earlier through maturing modernity, race took on many qualities of the religious. Call this the racially religious, the racial modalities in and through which religiosity is expressed. By contrast, late modernity's racial privatization, that is, the protection of privately expressed racism while declaring state racism a thing of the past. You can think the attack recently in the United States on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? I mean, there had been moves in Congress to actually end the Voting Rights Act, interestingly enough. So all that by way of articulating the religiously racial. The religious ways raciality is expressed, by contrast to the racially religious. At the same time, the religiously racial assumes the quality of both presumptive, unchallengeable, if ungrounded truth and its evangelizing circulation. The religiously racial and racially religious become so intertwined as to be barely distinguishable, even though I think we need to distinguish them analytically. The compulsion of assertive make-believe, of fantasized, you might say, theo or theologic determination, constitutes the social ground or grounds of the religiously racial. Its epistemic, you might say, dust curtain. The play on dust is from another work of mine called Epistemologies of Deception, which, if people are interested, I can give you the reference to. So on to the next section, states warring militarization. At the basis of the relationship of force, as Foucault puts it, stands a relationship of war. I want to broaden this notion of warring to signal a condition of social militarization, of militarizing society. The modern state is marked constitutively, ordered, made up, fabricated by modes of militarization, shaped by its modalities. The modern imagination, in short, its categories and concepts, its forms of order and organization, its very system of being and regimes of truth, is infused with militarized meaning and metaphor. The dominant expression of the modern state and its modes of thinking, its imagining of the world, and so its possibilities, are constitutively defined by militarization as a driving mode of its social being, self-conceiving and governance. So this is for the purposes of governing cities, internal to the US, right? So it's a municipality that has resorted to this in order to deal with local conflict, right? So the way in which the local becomes militarized, right? I mean, in the kind of, and I mean, long-standing in South Africa under the apartheid years, I mean, you saw these things on the streets almost on a day-to-day basis and so on, particularly in townships, but not only. So militarized and militarizing modalities, modes of imagining, as I'm putting it, of conception itself, thus are at the heart of how the modern state has come to conceive of itself, more often than not, that to which it aspires. It follows that the modern militarizing state is not one that is simply just inclined to go to wars. Militarizing societies operate on a logic of militarization. They are militarized as much in their social dispositions for everyday governing of populations, for, you might say, solving or resolving challenges, indeed for constituting what the challenges to the state are, within and without, as in their more traditionally conceived war preparation and war making. This requires, in both directions, not just a supposedly strong military, but a culture of militarization, a set of norms, values, modes of address and analysis, a vocabulary, a semantics, and a logic. And I want to suggest that this has been around a good while, right? So if you think of anthems, right, sort of national songs, right, and you look at the language, I mean, let impure blood water our furrows, and so on. The ways in which originally La Marseillaise was originally the war song for the army of the Rhine. I mean, that was its original title, right? The need to fight against the bloody banner of tyranny. that just continues the Stars and Stripes. I mean, you ever heard the national anthem of the U.S. sung before any major sports game, right? I mean, the language of articulation. If you can't read this, you can look it up online and so on. But rockets going off, and the home of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and et cetera, right? Similarly, a bit closer to your home, not mine, right? God Save the Queen, right? I mean, similarly. The ways in which, these patriotic songs that sort of bind us together under national self-formation embed the kinds of themes that I'm pointing to. What I won't put up here, but Destem, the anthem of the South African apartheid state, which has been kept in the post-apartheid moment, is Destem is literally translated the voice or the call, right? And combining this religious and militarized kind of logic in an embedded kind of racial resonance. You think of Memorial Day holidays, which we just had one in the US, across nation states, commemorating the fallen war sacrifices for the nation or for freedom, celebrated through often military parades and religiously ordained. Civic parades, Independence Day, May Day. I mean, right? One can go on and on and on in this kind of way. One can see the hints here of the transformation of church liturgy, hymns, morning prayer, into militarizing liturgy, anthems, saluting the flag, pledging allegiance, that will require a more detailed analysis than I've got time here for. Religious processions in some ways morphed into military parades. As Norbert Elias has long pointed out, Enlightenment rationality thus constituted and took itself to be constituting a dramatic shift from the effective states promoted first by religious and then by absolutist states. Civility, Elias emphasizes, is inseparable from, really a complex product of the transformation of warrior, with an A, or maybe with an O too, but with an A. And I would add church dominated into court society with the attendant shifts and persisting postulations in morals and manners, sensitivities and sensibilities, all increasingly thickeningly racially inscribed. Now, militarizing states embed within them an abiding concern with securitization. They initiate and enact modalities of self-directed securitization, and not just about externalities, the one contributing to the other, modeling, you could say, each other. They shore up inward and outward dispositions of militarization, of the imagination of warring, of being constantly at war. In this, security states initiate or extend socialities of militarization, internalize them. As Dilip Gwankar puts it, the call to increase policing in the face of crime and lawlessness is either the first step to or the first step towards expanding the militarization of the social. The war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on terror, etc., etc., etc. Police as a force introduced in the 19th century was self-consciously modeled on military organization. Forces, battalions, patrols, foot patrols, conquering and controlling city neighborhoods, officers, cadets, commanders, ranks, uniforms, you could say similarly schools. This makes evident the expanding militarization of the social. I mean, kids, youth movements and so on, right? Boy Scouts, etc. Add to this the establishment of generalized military service in the 19th century in the form of conscription for young men of the state, extending the intertwining tentacles of militarization and socialization in modern state formation. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, civic education, citizen subject formation, all again racially produced and reproduced. While republicanism in modern state formation has nominally created something of a firewall between church and state, to greater or lesser degree in different places, between religion and the political, the wall is at best porous, as numerous examples across national instances will attest. Militarization and the theological are sewn together, the theological secularized to greater or lesser degree in state expression, the state theologized in its reach for ever-expanding sovereign power. Muscular Christianity, that should give you a laugh but make you cringe at the same time, right? Muscular Christianity, the term that the Komarovs used to characterize this, perhaps most effectively gets in one formulation at this magnifying articulation. It conjures, to extend the notion, a muscular theopolity, a nation-state of supposed common birth origin traceable to the original father or father figure, the national fabric of which at once is electrified by the flow of presumptively common blood, and the expulsion of what is projected as, quote, impure blood, all as a response to or staving off or a purging of modernity's burgeoning heterogeneity. What I'm calling, lots of examples you could put up there, right? What I'm calling militarization, its discipline, its temporalities, the workday, the regime of the clock, the production line as falling into line, its habits, uniforms, training, the bearing it promotes or stands for, its modes of hierarchy, its controls, in short, its force fields, sets the example and provides a model for the social more generally. What social arrangement should model itself on or aspire to? The theological is manifest in the form of militarization, the shaping of sovereignty, the aspirations of a subjectivity committed to set convictions, and the contours of a constraining discipline become self-defining and self-refining, as not stepping out of line. The racial guarantees a belonging taken as common, a romanticized reach for a being together enabled by the projection of being alike. Cemented, you might say, by common conviction. So the next section, I want to turn to what I'm going to characterize as martial races. Let's call this trinity, religion, militarization, race, a mutually reinforcing politics of muscular theonomy, and at risk of a neologism of a theontology. Muscular theonomy marries theological conviction and law or rationality with force. Its theontics, to coin a term, grounds its mode of being, its ontology, in the theologic claim of common origins and foundations, and you might say landscapes as well. In short, in the fatherland. It's interesting that the fatherland, which etymologically traces, at least in English, to 1620, predates motherland by about 100 years, right? So, I mean, you see the way in which these things begin to get formulated over here. So implicitly embedded here, I suggest, is an extended and reworked notion of martial races, a coined term by George Fletcher Munn in 1933 in the context of India. In the narrowed historical conception of the notion formulated by Munn, Colonel Commandant of the Royal Artillery in India, martial races are those natives, for Fletcher in this case in India, deemed ready for military service, who are trustworthy enough, I'm drawing on the very language he uses, right? Who are trustworthy enough in strength of body, character, and judgment, in what he calls physique and physical courage. In short, martial races for him are those either open to missionary conversion or sufficiently embodying Christian-like virtues to carry out the ruling imperatives in the face of death-producing war. The title of his study, of his book, was Martial Races in India, which was published in 1933. Martial races, he writes, of the Indian context, is a small subclass of Indians. In the case of Europeans, well, at least West Europeans, he says, and I quote, "We do not speak of the martial races of Britain as distinct from the non-martial, nor of Germany, nor of France." So martial races characterize everybody, at least in his thought of who belongs in those countries. In India, by contrast, and I quote again, "We speak of the martial races as a thing apart, and because the mass of the people have neither martial aptitude nor physical courage, the courage that we should talk of colloquially as guts, Sikhs, Gurkhas, etc." Right? Europeans, by definition, supposedly all embody guts. Think of Aristotelian courage. Whereas among Indians, or you could say Africans, only a small, if in principle discernible proportion do. In the former case, these are birthright qualities, breathed in the cultural air. In the latter, once a disposition is discovered in some privileged subset, these qualities are taken to need nurturing, training, sustained cultivation. Racially naturalized for the former, racially historicized for those disposed among the latter. I want here to redirect this notion of martial races, giving it a more extended sense. Martial races are those produced and reproduced as the commanding or commanded subjects who are ontologically amenable and culturally available, in short. Those disposed to advancing militarization of the social in the generic. Martial races are both militarized and militarizing races. I'm tagging as martial races here those who are taken to combine raciological and religious character, manliness and loyalty, sovereign judgment and sacrifice, individualized privilege and independent power, honor and fighting spirit, what he calls fighting quality, the transcendental capacity to recognize and defend the racially registered and theologically grounded right and the good. Martial races then are made up of social subjects fashioned to embody these qualities, to enact warring masculinities, not just in military wars, but at all times, turning everyday life into battles, campaigns, crusades, even fights for survival. In battle, in struggle and challenge, in campaigning and striving to succeed, to win, martial races are disposed to sacrifice, in the end, even their lives, for the good not just of the nation, but of the team, by extension, the corporation, the institution, the family, the state, even the race itself. The ultimate form of militarizing citizenship is that of sacrifice for God and nation. Serving in the military, especially in a society not requiring conscription, is a giving up, a giving to kin and country. Conscription is an imposition, an obligation. Joining up is a sacrifice, a so-called free commitment, freely chosen out of honor or duty. Embedded in the definition of this or that martial race is to be found, sometimes only implicitly, the standard set for being a more or less full-fledged member of the society, a social subject with standing. Aggressively masculinized, war-driven risk-takers, fierce mercenaries with spine, nerves of steel, these are characterizations taken from a story about what it would make for good peacekeepers in 1997. I mean, think of it. Good peacekeepers should be risk-takers, fierce mercenaries with spine, nerves of steel. Right? I mean, these are guys keeping the peace, you know, so who's doing the fighting, right? The qualities, you might say, of an NFL quarterback or large corporate CEO in the face of campaigns and wars, taking and holding territory or real estate, hostile takeovers and colonizing acquisitions and mergers, 2-minute drills and split-second stock trades, scoring drives, hedging bets and corporate empires. After all, Wall Street After all, the central command trading desk at large stock trading companies on Wall Street is fondly called the turret or the war room, the operation theater. So what looks like this is referred to as the turret or the operation room. So you can see the way in which warring language is taken up in the culture of commercial practice. Members of the martial races are social subjects of standing, leaders even when led, bearers of social responsibility, but at once with privilege, presumptively, of course, white, structurally, or at least aspirationally so. In the extended sense I'm using it, not only do the martial races wage war and peace, keep order and control the agenda, they color the social shape and color in its sociality, shading its sensibilities and sensitivities, what is thought, its convictions and commitments, and what can be expressed. They claim or are claimed to carry what Jonathan Jansen, in a different though not unrelated context, in a book by this title, calls knowledge in the blood. A really interesting read of higher education in South Africa. A blending of body, type, and belief. The militarization of the social both reflects and reproduces militarizing races. The process of militarizing the social embeds both cultures of religiosity and the logics of raciality. It is embedded in and across broad social orders and practices. For example, in employment, where military service in some countries, in effect, becomes a deeply gendered and racially significant preferential employment and social security system. In Israel, for example, even now, but until very recently, almost exclusively, in order to hold certain positions, politically or in corporate structures, one has to have been not only to the military, but one has to have occupied certain positions within the military to be able to advance in that kind of way. And those positions were literally only open to white Israeli citizens. Right? So militarizing what we might characterize as what? Militarizing societies then. Militarizing societies then are societies, the organization, administration, and ordering structures, meanings and metaphors of which are disposed to and disposed by what I'm calling militarization. They are societies cultivating, embedding, indeed fueled by martial races in the sense embroidered above, by a structure of discipline on the individualizing register and regulation on the collective one. So discipline represents, in this extended Foucauldian sense, the processes for coordinating individuals, acting individually, though in unison to common purpose, so far as conditions allow, available information and technology enable. So it's, in a way, an acting on the individual person itself in order to produce certain effects and outcomes. Regulation, supplementarily, undertakes to establish the social conditions of systemic stability to enable predictable behaviors and so outcomes, to minimize disruption, to reassure that absent the unforeseen, acting in a consistent way to common information will affect recognizable and reliable outcomes, the relation between biking and getting on a train in the Netherlands, for example. Right? Disciplinary power economically affects individual compliance to social arrangements that otherwise might run against this or that individual's self-interest. It coordinates my actions with myriad others so that wrenching myself free, getting out of line, pushing against the grain are disruptions as much of my life as of the collective one from coordination with which I have taken leave. Regulation maintains a system of processes of population production and reproduction, biologically and socially, to which individual compliance aspires, from medical institutions to welfare systems, insurance regimes, housing estates, food regulations, religiously inspired norms, to racial classification schemes and modes of state securitization. And there's a sense in which, in our contemporary moment, all of that is shifting, right? That's not to say it's giving way and is long gone. It's shifting from one mode of regulation to another mode of regulation, from one set of disciplinary practices to another one, which is now going under the sign of neoliberalization. Ghassan Haj, the Lebanese-Australian anthropologist, wonderful interlocutor to think with, speaks of warring societies as those permanently geared towards war. Militarizing societies on this logic are those conceiving themselves individually through discipline and structurally through regulation in terms of a logics of militarization, sown strategically into the modes of formation and operation, their being and thinking, economically, politically, bureaucratically, socially, culturally. They order cultures not just of conception, but their horizons of expectation, the historically fantasized narration of its founding and unfolding. Their modes of production are fashioned around and anchored in militarizing instrumentality and styles of being. I mean, you know, we come to inhabit the very thing we claim we're against, right? It's kind of in various kinds of ways. While their regimes of truth are fashioned in terms of you say, driven by militarized frames, metaphors, meanings, movements, possibilities, and limitations. Just thinking of time over here and skipping some. So militarizing, I'll skip through some things. Militarizing societies, accordingly, are those in which anyone characterized as not belonging and threatening, what this guy is referring to, as beastly, along with those considered their associates or their bidders, is available for being killed or letting die, forgotten, say, while rotting away in a supermax solitary confinement or Guantanamo. And anyone deemed trustworthy in behalf of the state or its nominal interests can be licensed to kill, or increasingly can authorize unmanned killing via distance-destroying technologies. I mean, we all know this quite well. Technology is not necessarily invented in wars, though of course it may be. Technology nevertheless may get developed, invention expanded by war, directly and by the militarizing disposition more generally. I mentioned in a workshop we did over lunch that all our pressing technologies today have been conceived and designed deeply in relation to the military, right? I mean, just think of it, right? Whether it's mobile technologies, you know, going back into the early 20th century, like automobiles and motorbikes and airplanes and et cetera, refined increasingly, you know, mainframe computers, mobile computers, sensing devices, you go on and on, cameras and so on and so forth, weren't fashioned, of course, by the military, but taken over and given some sophistication in relation to military R&D, right? For example, the telegraph, so that's computing. The telegraph was invented in the first years of the French Revolution and then quickly got taken up in the conduct of war. Guns, obviously, but think of automobile, you know, I mean, the list that I've just given you, right? Technology is not only developed in war, but also in response to war. We lost the war because of inferior technology, so we better develop more effective technology now, and that invariably leads, of course, to future wars. Or we lost too many people needlessly, let's get the right technology to limit our losses in future wars. We now have the technology to prevail, so let's do it again and do it right. I mean, these kinds of rationalizations. Shock and awe is the implication of this logic. War similarly develops, expands, or mobilizes agility, speed, flexibility, not just in the conduct of war, but in daily governance, in the conduct of the everyday of social movement. You think of wide lane highways, which have often been built in many societies in order, you know, to move people in cars, but the principal reason for which is in case of internal local emergency, you can get armored vehicles sort of up and down them fast, right? Or in natural disaster emergencies and so on. One should be open to this too. There's good reason that the social arrangements came to be, so, you know, the system in Britain of the circles on sort of freeways, right, that you've got to go around kind of delimits that capacity, happily. There's good reason that this social arrangement came to be identified by Eisenhower, of all people, as the military academic industrial complex. I mean, we usually credit him with the military industrial complex. And actually, in the initial formulation, in a draft of his speech, he had academic in there and saw the university, the academy, as an integral part of this military technical formulation. But video games, exercise regime, survivor preparation, fashion wear, as I've mentioned, and so on, are all implicated in this. This technological prowess prompted by and prompting militarizing industriousness, if not war-making, has ratio-religious resonance also. The claim to technological skill and prowess becomes a touchstone for the pronouncement of God-endowed racial superiority. The rationality of technological capacity reveals prowess and evidence is theological chosenness, and of course gets put to use in defense of its self-proclamation. So I think in the, can I go on a little bit longer, or am I wearing patience thin? I should ask all of you. Okay, so I'm going to skip some things just in the interest of trying to preserve some time for discussion. We've seen all these examples, and they could be readily multiplied. The complex interplay of religious forces often reinforced with at least extended racial reference and resonance. This knotting of religiosities with racialities structures in specific conditions various ordering technologies of belonging and denial, of citizenship and disposability, of standing and dispensability. I mean, this is just a reference to Waiting. This is Philip Glass's production of Waiting for the Barbarians, sort of based on the Coetzee novel, but the way in which the barbarians are at the gate and kept at the gate, and there's this expectation of waiting to which it gives rise that I have an extended analysis over here. So this notion of militarized, racially militarized society to which I'm pointing, right, religiously conceived, is, I want to say, in part, a condition constantly in waiting, right? And so it calls for some analysis, extended analysis of waiting and what we're waiting for. We're waiting for the coming, we're waiting for the apocalypse, we're waiting for, et cetera, right? Militarization is a certain way, in both senses of the word, as particular and absolute, for society to manage itself. Militarizing societies are those operating on presumptions of certitude about what is right, good, what actions need to be taken, how to respond. There's a drive to minimize death of those taken as one's own and absolutize predictability. The stakes are life and death, after all. But only by expelling doubt, uncertainties, risk factors, either to the unthought, to the relative outside, as the unknown, that lacking certitude, the probabilistic, the ultimately unknowable. This drive completely, absolutely to know thy enemy, in the final calculation one's racially characterized non-being, is ultimately deific. The injunction to know God, to have his guiding hand become yours, and by self-rationalizing implication, yours, his, you, him, is at once the immodest reach to know it all, to turn oneself into the sovereign power, the ultimate decider, determiner of the ultimate fate of anyone deemed citizen, actual honorable, of the heavenly city. Race returning to its religious roots, lurking always in its shadow. Absolutely militarized society claims absolute power to itself, and absolute power can sustain itself only by militarization. So you go from Hobbes to Latin America. The reach of absolutized power for or in sustaining itself is necessarily militarized. Absolute and so absolutely militarizing power is a power that defines itself through exertion and command, an assertion, a stating, necessarily bound to implode. Like colonies previously, post-colonies and problematic states are zones of experimentation for penal and securitizing regimes, then re-imported into the metropoles. This signals the broader frames, trans-historical and transnational ways in which experimental technologies of governance and control operate. Regimes of securitization and policing are obviously ordered both through specific technologies of militarization and juridifications, driven by militarized modalities, here in the plural. For example, Blackwater honed its skills in Iraq by being the guards that the military couldn't provide to political brass from the U.S. and then got redeployed in the wake of the Katrina flooding, right? Were privately hired to come and operate completely unoverseen by any state formation. So a private security company, right, comes in armed just like this, looking like this, right? Into the context of post-Katrina New Orleans, and secures property against looting and invasion and so on, without any answer to anybody else, other than the payer, right? At the same time, militarizing societies tend to abhor critical interventions, no less critical intellectuals. Militarizing societies produce, you might say, confirmatory citizens, those that confirm by repeating the standard state social organizational line that rejects, for the most part, out-of-the-box thinking or disconfirming counterfactuals of the kind we were talking about at lunch. In this, militarizing societies sit easily with religiously racial orders. Militarizing societies then have come to elaborate their mode of organizational order in the form of hierarchical managerialism. Management, the equivalent of the officer corps, define the game plan, usually without consulting those they charge to carry it out. They define the permissible and so possible, seek to effect discipline and issue regulations until they screw up and then they fire it, right? They give orders, expect compliance, recognize and reward advancement or success. Indeed, today they even badge. Promote and dismiss. You recall Romney's, and I think this is emblematic, I like to fire people, right, in the last US election campaign, in a way mimicking Donald Trump's The Apprentice, right? This absolute power given to one in order to affect people's lives just because I have the power. The military thus became to modernity perhaps what the church has been to the medieval, the symbol and instrument of regulating social order, the disciplining fraternal order, the mark and measure of social character, social personality, the locus of prevailing political economy. Wars accordingly solve two dilemmas at once. First, the dilemma of wars offer this kind of command control. They expand markets, absolutely, for the kinds of goods that are produced. And they fashion, in that very term, they fashion demand, right? So they occupy the kind of John Stuart Million logic of political economy, right, for capital, which is that it's constantly needing to create demand through fashioning new desire. And wars have shown to do that. Wars accordingly solve two dilemmas at once. First, the dilemma of the political, how to fold the population under a single logic of governance so that the population itself aspires to be so governed. And second, the economic dilemma of not running out of markets for its wares. But they must be wars, and this is where the extension of militarization becomes key, that cannot most of the time be all-out affairs, for that would exhaust capital, human and financial, and social energies and resources, even as wars are forays for more of all of this, for expanding social capital in all its expressions. For the most part, these are low-level wars. They may flare up from time to time, but then simmer back down, kept from perpetual boil over. If once wars were rallying points, pulling the nation together into a united front, if that's what they were, today it seems the best sort of war would be that to which the general population paid little notice. It would be not too expensive or debt-producing, not too deadly, not too exhausting, not too demanding, not too attention-grabbing, but just enough. A war that expands market demand at the upper end while undercutting social thriving at the lower one. This, it seems, is the extreme entailment of the logic of militarization. And you could say, and racial configuration is central or key to this, this ecology of fabricated ignorance and ignoring that takes place over here. And race becomes crucial as a legitimating target, the target, you could say, of opportunity for the ongoing just-in-time, just-enough warring. For warring on a racially articulated basis offers up a model of sustainable endeavor. They will always be there, a threat to our very being, our homogeneity, our well-being. If not conveniently there when most called for, the non-belonging will be invented, as they invariably are. Conversos just make it harder to distinguish and discern them. They don't disappear, they just seep into us, religiously maintaining their original character racially understood. If the target doesn't exist, it will have to be manufactured, as consent to contain it at all costs inevitably will be too. Militarization thus means vigilance against complacency, marginalization of the weak-willed, repression of our own non-martial instincts whenever they might surface, an erasure of the racially religious, threatening the not us who lurk in our midst, threatening us. The threat, of course, more about us than them. I mean, you think here, for example, of the likes of Trayvon Martin in the US instance, and so on. Militarizing society today, then, is an implicit social contract in this metaphorical sense, really an implicit understanding, a common sense. It pulls together the leaders, after all, our representatives, directing policy towards militarization, with the warring it inevitably maintains, the manpower manning the imagined barricades and fighting whatever war du jour might be, and the popular citizenry who seem at least passively accepting of paying for it and supplying the bodies necessary to keep manning the militarization, so long as they are someone else's sons and daughters, as much in class and racial terms as in more narrowly related kin conception. So I'll end just by noting there's a section at the end, but I'm going on too long. A section on what I call demilitarization. So what would it take to demilitarize, to engage in a logic as a counter of demilitarization? And when you think of it, I mean, even the logic, even the terms of opposition to all of this gets infused with a kind of military or militarizing resonance. Think of the way in critical theory you talk of interrogation, right, which would make us slightly nervous in all of this, of strategies, right, of tactics, even in struggle, of mobilization. I mean, how do we, to play on Ngugi wa Thiong'o's and others' notion of decolonizing the imagination, how do we demilitarize the imagination, right, the cultural imaginary, right, in terms of being able to promote a way of thinking that, even as we talk of a disposition of insurgency, say, right, in the face of all of this, what would it amount to? Right, can we talk of something like a politics of irritation, right, by contrast, right, of both being irritated by but irritating, by extension, right, and so on. Just to find ways to think of undercutting, right, how readily we collectively fall into these forms of thinking, even as we're critical. So finally, if the posthuman as conception and condition of being revises long-standing conceptions of what it has been taken to be, to count as human, blurring the lines between culture and nature, human and beastliness, person and animal, as many have, from Derrida to Donna Haraway have commented, we can ask how the post-racial, so now, right, how you put together the post-human and the post-racial, undertakes to resettle by re-theologizing and remilitarizing the social. Again, you can think, of a whole range of cases from Trayvon Martin to Mark Duggan. Right? Does demilitarization entail then the production of a new humanity? I think here of something like Michael Hart's work on the commons. What are the resources to draw on in thinking this through? A notion of a reconceived humanity, right? So you can think of another genealogy of resources from people like Du Bois or most particularly Alain Locke, right? Thinking of the new Negro in the Harlem Renaissance, right? Or Fanon's new humanity, right? Similar in a similar genre. We could ask what demilitarizing citizenship and subjectivity would amount to if it's possible to have a notion of citizenship that is in fact demilitarized. What would a and subjectivity, what they would amount to, bending and demasculizing and deracing belonging, right? What would a demilitarized conception of humanity, of the social, of the political look like? And what, in the final analysis, would be the implications for de-theologizing the political? These are the questions I want to close with by opening up their lines of questioning. So this is Banksy on the West Bank, right? I mean, a kind of interesting inversion of the militarization. So, you think of these somewhat humorous but also quite poignant inversions of, and is inversion sufficient in some sense? So I will end just with this. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating, enormous amount of information to take in and think about. I have one question. I think back in the day, Charles Beard talked about something similar to this, like a perpetual state of war that funded the American state, but he saw it in terms of, like collecting resources aggressively. So my simple question would be, if all of this is happening, why? Why do you think it is happening? Does it have a certain energy of its own, or is it about greed and collecting material wealth?
Yeah, big complex question. These things are never simple. They're never one-off causal conditions. They're massively overdetermined. I was trying to map some of the, quickly sort of map some of the elements at play. One of the things one could say, if the stress, if what falls under the sign of the neoliberal, right, at its very heart, is not just a privatization, but a kind of radical individualization, right? And a radical individualization, both at the level of responsibility. So one is now, think of, I'm not sure where Social Security is going in Britain, but I can imagine. But certainly in the US, there have been repeated attempts, and now, those who've made the attempts, particularly on the right, realize that they're not going to be able to privatize Social Security all at one fell swoop. So they're doing it in terms of 1,000 cuts, right? So kind of a cut here, a cut there, a forcing of people to take responsibility for themselves, their very language, right, and turn it into a society in which one's looking after oneself and one's completely responsible for oneself. And it's not that at the level of this, interestingly enough, what happens, the first off kind of conception of the neoliberal was the neoliberal is getting rid of the state, right? Marx's dream, right? The withering away of the state was about to happen, but under rather pernicious circumstances. People have pointed out, the Komarovs among others, and a number of us have made this argument, that the state is not diminished. It's just radically restructured in the direction of, if what I've called the caretaker state, what here used to be called the nanny state, right, is being diminished, right, in structure and size and service delivery and so on. That notion of the container state, you might say, it's been replaced by what I've come to characterize as the traffic cop state, the state that polices, right, both in military and policing terms, the flows of capital, financial and human, the flows of goods and services identified with globalization, right? So the sense is that, in a more direct response to your question, as you get this, the stress on individual and personalized responsibility, the structure of the state is shifting, right, to police the boundaries in different ways, right? And so the state becomes identified with this form of policing and war making on a global scale, right? In behalf of, not just straightforwardly in behalf of capital, that's too simple, but in behalf of maintaining a set of structures, right, where business activity and investment and so on can operate, which is not to get rid of war precisely, because it's often said by economists themselves, you produce the most profit in times of greatest risk, right? You're taking the risk in order to generate, right? And they ate their lunch in 2008 onwards, right, in a variety of ways. But it hasn't stopped them from coming back for more, right, in a manner of speaking. So it's, the shorthand answer to your question is why it's happening is because of these structural shifts that have been taking place. And you're seeing the structures shifting into these. And what I'm arguing is that, at least from the 19th century onwards, from, the point we begin to call high modernity, capital and not just war making, but the forms of desire and commodification that go along with those things have increasingly fueled the cultural imagination, right? Because we've come to lean in our daily lives on those sorts of things and to think ourselves increasingly through those call them cultural ideas. The most obvious of which was, high fashion culture is battle fatigue, right? It's pithy, but right. And then these other things where we don't even think about the relation to. The internet was, right. Invented not by Al Gore but by DARPA, right, which is the defense research facility in the US. Like the mainframe computer came out of DARPA, DARPA-funded research.
I think my question sort of aims at how we can think of demilitarization, or how we can frame struggle in terms that are demilitarized. Because I think when we look at Foucault's idea of race war, he's actually describing how it is he frames it as a struggle, right? A struggle against sovereignty and against oppression first, which then switches to state racism. So there's some potential sort of in that first, or in how he frames war in race war terms there. So I'm sort of, and as you say, sort of it goes through our how we frame struggle, at mobilization and so on. These terms sort of stick with us in struggle against exactly this society that is militarized and racialized and so on. So my question is sort of how, or is it necessary to sort of reverse this term of militarization? Obviously, I don't mean that, but sort of this problem of sort of being between struggle and militarization. How can we think about that?
It's a good question. I was hoping you would think along with me, but we were again talking briefly in a different context. We were talking about the humanities at lunchtime, and Occupy came up, right? And I mean, there's, I don't mean that Occupy should be the response to this question, but it provides hints. Right? And what is so interesting about Occupy is no demands were made. Right? I mean, there was a struggle within the Occupy movement itself, at least in the Wall Street formulation of it, right? Sort of on the ground, over whether it should be top down and hierarchical, and there should be leaders in that struggle, that sort of 19th century version of struggle that we've come to inherit through the 20th century and so on and so forth. And, or whether it should be much more horizontal, right? And in which, decision-making mechanisms were established that through consensus making and so on, no demands would be made on society at large and so forth. So it begins to clarify or hint at, if not clarify, ways of thinking outside of those frames of reference and frames of, that provide hints of where one might go in order to seek for ways in which to think about the language of analysis that one might invoke, right? So that's not a very satisfactory way of pointing to other ways of thinking about these things, right? The way in which, whenever anybody spoke, right, there'd be these waves of repeating so that people, and all of this a kind of strategic response to the sorts of repression to which they were subjected to in Zuccotti Park and elsewhere, right, by police and so forth. I just by chance happened to be in a hotel on Wall Street the day they were chased, the night actually, they were chased out of Zuccotti Park. I was at a meeting in New York and we happened to be placed in a hotel and it was, when I walked by there at 11 o'clock at night, I mean, the park was full and it was vibrant and so on. And, I walked out at 9 o'clock or whatever it was the next morning and walked up Broadway. And there were more police in the park than there were anybody else. And in that, 6 or 7 or 8 hour period, right, the place had been cleaned up. But so they were responding, for example, not using microphones, right? Because then they could be busted for disturbing the peace after 10 o'clock at night or whatever it was. And things of that nature. So it was a kind of dance betwixt and between and around. And of course, you could say, well, look, what has happened to Occupy? Well, what has happened is it's introduced a way of thinking about possibility, about possible thinking in critical form in relation to the state. I mean, that's probably its legacy rather than a particular anarchistic movement that, but which has kind of disappeared almost into the fabric around us, right? It's and so, we're talking at the lack of, job opportunities and so on at lunchtime, and the way in which these counter forms of thinking are beginning to emerge. So it's not, there's no, I think Michael Hart, as interesting as he is probably mistaken to think that there's an analysis one can give. I mean, Empire begins, and then the stuff on mass movements sort of begins to formulate. You can begin to sort of get at the fabric of it, but there's no totalizing analysis you can give, precisely because it's not about totalization, right? And so it requires a different analytics, I think, and that's the challenge, right? And one that doesn't, that I don't mean to say one should throw out all of the, the 150 years of analysis of movements in this way. I mean, think of Arab Spring would be another way of, the forms of engagement and repressions and critical responses to repression and so on that has taken place in the wake of, where Spring quickly became, something else, right? But there are lessons to be learned from all of that in a variety of ways. And, contrast that with militarized, militarizing resistances, or militarized resistances, which are very top-down, making strategic political decisions. You read of Hezbollah's kind of engagement in Syria today. I mean, right? It's something, there's a really interesting history over there. In after Israel, really quite flattened Dahia in Beirut in the summer of 2006. Hezbollah, very interestingly, something like 260 10-story apartment buildings were completely destroyed, right, in a matter of weeks, right, by Israeli bombing. A suburb of Beirut, right? And 750 buildings were partially damaged. It took Hezbollah 5 years to completely rebuild the neighborhood, where you wouldn't see that any damage had been done, even saying that they know it's going to happen again, right? So, $500 million, 5 years, the production of a way of being and living sort of in this neighborhood, absolutely outside of the jurisdiction of the state, right? So they built to a code, right? They had a building code. The code just wasn't a state code because it would have taken 15 years, not 5 years, right? And so on and so forth. And a whole plan of, there's a kind of militarized set of possibilities that produce that. Top-down, hierarchical, and so on, right? But it produces these other things as well, right? I mean, so one should look at both sort of elements of it.
My question may maybe follow on from, your last part of your answer. In your historical sketch, you argued that, racial formation, masculinization in martial terms, militarization, all were part of a kind of state constitution process. And then, you would suggest that, as history moves on in a neoliberal moment, these things are in movement, paradigms are changing. To a certain extent, your argument invites to think, the state is the problem. And I was just wondering, whether you think about, let's say, racialization, but also war militarization, outside of, nation-state-driven, projects, or, outside of the reproduction of the nation-state?
Let me just ask you what you're driving at. I mean, when you say outside of the production of the nation-state, I mean, what is the outside of the nation-state in all of this?
Outside of the nation-state could be, empire, for example. Outside of the nation-state could be, let's say, state structures which are collapsing and failing, and leading to civil war situations, or, I was just,
right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, clearly, the state is implicated in the imperial process, right? In the forms of empire, even in the more extended forms of imperial making. So there's a very long story, right, analysis that would be required in that regard. And leave a legacy even as transformations set in. Race, I was going to joke that I don't think about racialization. I mean, there's a literal sense to that. I don't use the term racialization in my work since racist culture. I mean, I used it in racist culture, but not long after that, I just found it empty, right? I mean, it's so variously used, and so means you have to draw on other categorizations in order to sort of try and get at what it is one's trying to say here. The question becomes, I mean, because in not this argument here, although implicit in the argument here are arguments I've made before about the way in which the modern state, the way in which states become modern, are deeply implicated in race making, right? So the state makes race and race makes the state, right? And the modern state becomes modern in and through racial configuration, right? Differently in different places, of course, but deeply implicated with each other. That's not to say that racial configuration in its legacy, right, doesn't then exceed the state, right, whether in failed, what you're characterizing as failed states or weak states or states that are imploding, right, in forms of governance and so on, and there the way in which race is taken up, both as a materializing force on the one hand, and in terms of analytics about those sets of conditions, are quite complex. Often it's on the part of states using racial language to belittle or characterize or exclude or demean or rationalize the possibility of policing or invention or military action in relation to those states that are taken to be failed or failing or weak, and and there are lots of examples of that, right? And so you get both the historical form of racial expression on the one hand and new expressions and configurations of it on the other, precisely in relation to that set of instances, right? In a variety of complex ways. What I thought you were also hinting at, which is interesting, is what happens within those formations, right? Of the way in which people, groups take up racial language. Sudan, right? Groups in Somalia, and so on and so forth, right? Perhaps the Shia Sunni sets of tensions in various parts of the Middle East, and so on, India, Pakistan. You can go on and on in this kind of way. How is race taken up within the confines of those structures, right, in characterizing each other, right? I mean, are there ways in which both explicitly and by implication, the logics, I mean, if Foucault's right, that the logics of struggle mirror onto the racial, right, in the sense of race struggle that he has characterized, then one should be able to say even in those terms, right, precisely because they have imbricated within them, you know, the legacies of imperial projects from Europe and so on and so forth, right? And that would be, I mean, I just haven't done the work to be able to spell out in detail for that, but that, I think that's an interesting question.
I realize we're going over time, but maybe we can have one more question.
Thank you, and I hope this will be clear, and I'll try and be brief with it. Okay, so I like the kind of reference to Schmidt, and just to pick up on that, I was just obviously like kind of the political as institution as being constituted of all social relations and assuming the state. So I'm just wondering, how far is it a militarization of the social as much as it is a militarization of the political? And I guess kind of could you elaborate a bit on that relationship between the social and
I mean,
the
it's
political?
both, right?
Yeah.
And the militarization of the political, I mean, you see it in relation to the ways in which, I mean, you know, political campaigns, I mean, the very language of conventional politics is infused with the language of military engagement, right? And are run, you know, in a way as military campaigns, you know, or as they imagine military campaigns to be run, right? With tactics and strategies and, you know, all those things that fall under its rubrics. So, you know, the political in a more extended sense of the political, right, which have to do with the kinds of relations between subjects that both make up a state and also exceed a state, that operate between states and so on, right, certainly get taken up. I mean, you know, I mean, it's militarized in some obvious sense, right, that you know, what I'm characterizing in terms of militarization as modes of regulation and discipline are invoked in order to, you know, for want of a better term, police the boundaries of that set of configuration, both within states and exceeding states, right, and between states, and in spaces of statelessness, right. So, I mean, if there are spaces of statelessness and they become threatening or worrisome from the point of view of this or that hegemonic state or dominant state, sort of hegemonic state system and so on, you know, they'll also be either boundaried out and off or invaded in some way, right, or both at different moments in time. So Somalia being a case in point. Now, you know, clearly these sites and localities and geographies are racially configured. If they haven't previously been racially configured, they quickly get drawn into racial configuration once they become identified as problem sites, right? And so the political in that more extended sense of the term, which reaches beyond the state boundaries, right? And where are the state boundaries today, actually, right? I mean, if you think of the US giving itself jurisdiction to go anywhere in order to protect itself, literally, right? You know, which gets contested sort of at the edges, but you know, doesn't prevent or stop this extension of itself into, you know, this extension to itself of a jurisdiction, you know, to exceed or traverse or, you know, refuse, depending on how you want to put it, you know, the traditional boundaries of state formation. So in that sense, both in terms of the formulation of the claims and in terms of the resistance to the claims, right? I mean, politics, which after all at basis is about the relation of power, right, is at work. You know, sovereignty then gets reconfigured, obviously, in relation to who has it and who, you know, where its boundaries are drawn and so on.